Dark and Darker's introduction of the Battle Royale zone is something that gets brought up a lot when talking with friends, coworkers, and even in the comments of the last video. Having chatted about this to death, I figured I'd put a short video together to talk about this while using it as an opportunity to introduce the topic of trade-offs in game design. But before we begin, I wanted to take a few seconds to thank everyone who watched, liked, commented, and subscribed on the last video. This channel is a little project I started back in 2020 with the aim of demystifying game design, and I appreciate all of you for helping make this happen. At 1000 subscribers, YouTube considers you to be a real boy, and we're closing in on that super fast. So if you like what you see here and want to help me hit that goal, consider subscribing, but honestly, the fact that you're all even watching these is good enough for me. So thank you. Okay, now let's talk game design. Let's start by breaking down the Battle Royale zone super fast and talk about why it exists. In Battle Royale games like PUBG and Forknife, the zone represents the playable space on the map. The longer the map goes on, the tighter the zone gets. Standing outside the zone causes you to take damage over time until you step inside it. This damage often starts weak but escalates as the game progresses. So why does the zone exist? Well, the zone has one major goal, and that is to drive consistent conflict around the map. Think of how dull a Battle Royale match would be if the circle didn't exist. People could just hide forever in a corner of the world and matches could last forever. The fact that the playable space constricts over time guarantees consistent conflict as the map progresses, and ensures that matches don't last all day. Also, like a lot of successful mechanics, it results in some interesting emergent strategies and decision making as players learn to play around the zone in different ways. Okay, so we all know what the zone is now and why it exists. Now let's take a look at its inclusion in Dark and Darker. In Dark and Darker, the zone is implemented pretty much verbatim but with one minor tweak. The damage dealt by the zone is actually pretty minimal and forgiving compared to other implementations. This change is mostly due to the fact that Dark and Darker's maps aren't open spaces. They're tight, maze-like designs, so if you find yourself caught on the wrong side of it, and the zone is closing in on you, you'd have to journey a good ways through the darkness to get to safety. The zone in Dark and Darker does its job at keeping players moving and clustering them more and more into tighter fields as the game progresses. But it does come at the cost of sometimes feeling a little hectic. People who aren't big fans of the inclusion of this mechanic in Dark and Darker talk about how it's absent from other extraction type games. So let's start by taking a look at how maps play out in other extraction games like Tarkov. In Tarkov, when you load into a map, you and several other players are scattered among the different player starts. Each map has a generous time limit and you are left to explore the entirety of the map as you see fit. Now Tarkov is still a PvP game, so the designers ultimately want to drive you to some conflict, and they do so using a few key tricks. First, they often spawn you and an enemy group pretty close to one another to guarantee some fighting early on. Second, the maps oftentimes have choke points in them that a lot of people will need to pass through in order to extract. Third, and probably most effective of all, the map has fixed high-tier loot locations that players rush to early on and fight over. One last thing worth mentioning about Tarkov is how they use sound. You can often hear a battle breaking out from across the map, and if you want conflict, you can charge towards it, and if you don't want any, you just avoid it. As you play a game like Tarkov, over time you learn which areas are dangerous and which are likely safer, which lets you meander about on the outskirts of a map away from dangers and be generally undisturbed for your play session. Now let's see how maps play out in Dark and Darker. Maps in Dark and Darker have some of the techniques used in Tarkov to draw conflict. They have coveted loot locations, and sometimes they spawn you reasonably close to another group of players. Sound is not effective at driving conflict on a map-wide scale in Dark and Darker simply because you don't expect the swinging of a sword or firing of an arrow to make enough noise that it can be heard across the map. So the Battle Royale zone is really what does the heavy lifting here when it comes to driving conflict across the map. As it closes, you're squished into a tighter play space and you're guaranteed to at least run into another player. Also, the zone ends up being something you can play around in interesting ways. Are you being chased by a group of players? You can run into the zone and try to give them the slip. Are you chasing someone yourself? Well, you can see how the zone is progressing and try to guess where your target might pop out. On the flip side though, it could overwhelm you and make you feel rushed, especially in cases where you feel like you don't have enough time to do what you need to do before the zone closes in on you. So now you've seen what Dark and Darker does and what Tarkov does. So which is better? Well, it depends on what you as designers are going for. And to understand this, we're going to need to talk about a concept in game design called trade-offs. When facing most design problems, you'll rarely find a right answer. Every choice you make when designing your game will often give you something, but it comes at the cost of something else. That's what we call a trade-off. One very common example often given is the balance between accessibility and complexity. In general, the more complex your game is, the less accessible your game becomes. So let's say you're working on your very own extraction game and you want to add ammo as a mechanic. What do you do? In the cycle, for example, there are 5 types of ammo, one for each classification of weapon. But in Tarkov, there are literally hundreds of types of ammo, each with their own set of stats affecting things like damage, armor penetration, travel trajectory, and so on. Clearly, the cycle's design is more accessible while Tarkov's is more complicated. So which one's better? Well, again, it all depends on what you're going for. Tarkov's ammo system seems like overkill, but when judging a mechanic like this, it's important that you understand what sort of game you're trying to make. Tarkov is really geared towards this military simish, gun nut player fantasy, so they really try to model out ballistics as best they can. Their ammo system also plays really well with their armor and health mechanics. So for Tarkov, it fits. The cycle is more geared towards making the genre more approachable, so a simplified ammo design is what they went for. So that's the idea of a trade-off. Your choices will often give you something, but they always come at the cost of something else. A good rule of thumb when dealing with trade-offs is to think about the overall vision of the game and the fantasy you're trying to deliver and execute around that. As an aside, learning how to maximize depth without adding too much complexity or sacrifice accessibility is one of those avenues of progression you'd need to hone in on as a game designer if you want to be good at your job. Alright, so with all that said, what's the verdict of the Battle Royale zone in Dark and Darker? Well, let's contrast the two. In Tarkov, you have an abundance of time and the freedom to go anywhere. Sound, player spawns, choke points, and higher tier loot locations are what mainly drive conflict around the map, but you also have the option to avoid conflict altogether and stick to the outskirts. Dark and Darker guarantees conflict and faster sessions by using the Battle Royale zone. The zone adds to the game through emergent mechanics and decision making, but also can make players feel rushed or forced to make decisions they don't want to make, like having to leave valuable loot behind because the zone is closing in on them. So what do you think? If you were in charge of Dark and Darker, would you leave this mechanic in or would you remove it? Personally, I think the mechanic works really well in Dark and Darker, and without it the game would need to be significantly different in order to drive conflict across the map. You'd be hard pressed to find any conflict if the zone was removed. Since extracts are dynamic and because of how most of their weapons are melee and how reasonably easy it is to slip away from someone, if you didn't have the zone smushing you into other players, you'd likely rarely see conflict. What's more, if you remember the chat about trade-offs earlier, think about what each game is trying to do here. I think Dark and Darker is trying to deliver an intense adrenaline rush each delve into their dungeon, so the Battle Royale zone ends up fitting quite well. But what do you think? Would you keep this mechanic in Dark and Darker, or would you remove it and change the game around it? Think through what would need to change, and if you're up for it, write a comment below. This channel is small enough right now where I definitely see every single comment and respond. Design decisions are rarely as cut and dry as you might think, and more often than not, game development is a series of negotiating trade-offs and thinking through the repercussions. When dealing with trade-offs, it's important to remember the vision of your game and the fantasy you're trying to deliver. Adding the zone in Dark and Darker works really well for the sort of game that they're trying to make, so ultimately, it's a good add, and it's not likely to go anywhere. I hope you found this video insightful. Thanks for watching everybody, I appreciate you all and I look forward to chatting with you next time.